Amongst the famous five, Emily Murphy was known best. Born in Ontario, she was surrounded by many politically inclined family members, so she was well versed in politics. She moved west, first to Manitoba, then settled in Edmonton, Alberta. Emily was a writer as well as a member of over 23 reform activities that served in the interests of women and children. In 1911, Alberta passed the Dower Act, a provincial legislation preventing a married person from disposing the homestead without consent of their spouse, which includes personal property and life estate. This act was created due to Emily's efforts. In 1916, Emily became the first female magistrate in the British Empire. Later, she was challenged in court by a lawyer who asserted that she was not a person according to British law. She was not to approach this problem alone. Irene Parlby was raised in London, England. At 13 years old, she moved to India while being educated in Germany and Switzerland. After traveling Europe, she moved to Alberta. She became the president of the United Farm Women of Alberta, a group that initiated changes in legislation that affected income tax reform, widows' pensions, mothers' allowances, and credit for young farmers. She also pressed for better education, libraries, and health care for rural families. Irene aided in the Dower Act, helping it pass through Alberta legislature. In 1921, Irene was nominated as the running candidate for the United Farmers of Alberta political party leader. She became the MLA and was even appointed to cabinet by Premier Herbert Greenfield. Though Irene was without mandate and budget, she took care of issues related to women and children. Parlby was very active on issues related to health care, wages of working women, and married women's property rights, much like her friend Henrietta. Henrietta Edwards was another huge influence in Alberta. She was born in Montreal, Quebec, and learned much about women's legal rights from her parents' democratic religious faith. Their marriage contract was modern for the time, as her mother was guaranteed protection from her husband's debts. Later in her life, Henrietta and her sister Amelia launched Women's Work in Canada, the first Canadian magazine for working women, and they only employed women. After speaking with her, Henrietta and Lady Aberdeen, the Governor-General's wife, established and founded several organizations. In 1901, Henrietta joined the Christian Women's Temperance Union, whose goal at the time was prison reform, financial allowances for women, and equal grounds for divorce. In 1917, Edwards worked with Emily and Irene. She was also informed about another key player in Canadian women's suffrage. Louise McKinney was born in Ontario, later moving to North Dakota where she lived with her sister. She later became a part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the main objectives being the prohibition and women's right to vote. Her and her family moved to Alberta and opened many women's Christian temperance unions all across Alberta and Saskatchewan. On April 19, 1916, Alberta allowed most women the right to vote and run for office. She was the first woman in the British Empire to be elected in the legislature. Louise was invited to Emily's, where she would meet the fifth of the group. Millie McClung was born in Ontario, and while still young, her and her family moved to Manitoba. She taught at one of the schools where she met connections and became involved in many social reform groups. Nellie joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union to aid problems associated with alcohol abuse, leading to interest in women's suffrage. Nellie became a founding member of the Political Equity League, a group that represented and petitioned for various political objectives such as women's votes and racial disputes. In 1916, she convinced T.C. Norris to endorse female suffrage, and he agreed as long as there was a petition with 17,000 signatures on it. Once he was elected, Nellie and 39 others displayed a petition with 39,584 signatures. Women in Manitoba could vote as of January 28, 1916. This did not account for all of Canada. By May 24, 1918, women could vote in every province but Quebec. Quebec did not let women vote until 1940. After Nellie fought relentlessly for human rights and social reform, campaigning for Aboriginal and Asian women's rights. August of 1927, Nellie and the rest of the famous five met in Emily's home and discussed their plan to change the government's mind on women being people. Irritated, Emily Murphy gathered 4 other women in her home, Nellie, Louise, Irene, and Henrietta. Together they discussed the matters of women not being considered persons under the British North America Act of 1867. Henrietta was a renowned advocate and member of women's suffrage groups, so it was very easy for the group to petition the government for an order in council that would make the Supreme Court rule on whether or not qualified persons included women in Section 24 of the BNA Act. April of 1928, the Senate ruled it did not include females. The group then asked for an appeal to the Privy Council in Britain, which was permitted. On October 18, 1929, the Privy Council reversed the Supreme Court's judgment, saying that females were included. However, after the rulings, none of the group was invited to join the Senate. Instead, Karen Ray McKay Wilson was the first lady appointed to Senate. One important player for feminism in Saskatchewan was Violet McNaughton, who was born in England and moved to Saskatoon. She was a journalist who was involved with the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association. Violet insisted on being recognized as a delegate to the 1913 Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association convention that led to a special women's congress, which eventually led to a women's section with Violet as the secretary. McNaughton was elected president, which lasted until 1917. In 1915, she started the formation of the Saskatchewan Equal Franchise League that was primarily responsible for helping attain the franchise for women a year after. She became the president of the Interprovincial Council of Farm Women in 1919, which led her to be a prominent national feminist leader. Violet McNaughton joined Laura Jamieson and Agnes MacPhail to represent Canada at the International Congress of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Czechoslovakia. The second important woman in Saskatchewan was Violet's partner in politics and business, Zoa Haidt. She was the vice president of the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association as well as the Saskatchewan Equal Franchise League. As a member of the non-partisan league in the district of Thunder Creek, she ran for provincial office in 1917. It was an unsuccessful attempt. It was not always this simple, however, as there were more minorities than white women. In 1861, there was a shortage of white and Chinese women. Mostly men left China to fulfill Canada's demand for laborers. There was a great imbalance between the male and female populations that was a few hundred women and a few thousand men. In Canada, the Chinese women had no support in raising their children and were secluded because of the limitation on their interaction. Though the head tax had made it exceedingly difficult financially for the Chinese to increase their population. In the late 1800s, the Methodist Church made a rescue home for Chinese women and girls who escaped prostitution, beginning in British Columbia. In the 1920s, First Nations men and women were still under the Indian Act, which stated that they could vote if they did not hold a treaty status. As for education, First Nations people were collected and entered into residential schools in hopes of assimilating them into white society during the late 1800s, which would last until the late 1900s, but were at their peak in the 1930s. They did not receive their right to vote until 1965. While the struggles of feminism and racism continued, hypocrites and angered men appeared everywhere, some more courteous than others. In Quebec, Premier Louis-Alexandre Taschereau was approached by Therese Casgrain, who requested that women be allowed to vote. He told her that he would not be the one to give her that right to females. Nellie McClung was turned down by Premier Rodman Roblin about giving women the right to vote. Henry Bourassa, a politician who was supposedly feminist, predicted women's votes would turn the women into a bunch of women men, destroying the woman wife and woman mother. It would bring a drop in birth rate, undermine authorities, and destroy families.